When a woman hurts you, whether through disrespect, a sudden change in her tone, emotional withdrawal, or a blatant act of betrayal, the first instinct most men have is to react immediately. They want answers, closure, an apology, or at the very least some acknowledgement that what happened was wrong. But reacting in the moment of pain is exactly what traps you. You're responding from the wound, not from your strength. And when you respond from the wound, you give her the ability to shape the narrative, control the emotional frame, and determine how the situation unfolds. What most men fail to understand is that a woman watches your reaction to discomfort more carefully than anything else. She studies how easily you lose yourself, how quickly you become emotional, and whether your sense of self collapses the moment she pulls away or pushes a boundary. Your reaction teaches her more than your words. If you explode, she sees instability. If you plead, she sees insecurity. If you argue, she sees emotional dependency. The only response that actually resets the dynamic is emotional separation. Not the petty silent treatment, not manipulation, not trying to make her jealous, real separation. The kind of quiet distance that comes from choosing to step away so you can understand what actually happened, instead of drowning in the emotion she triggered in you. That space allows clarity, and clarity is power. Without that space, you will misjudge her intentions, misinterpret her actions, and end up reacting to a story your emotions created instead of the truth. Distance lets you see whether her behavior was a mistake, a pattern, or a message. And until you see it clearly, you cannot respond like a man in control of himself. When you're hurt by a woman, the instinct to seek validation is one of the most dangerous traps a man can fall into. Pain makes you want acknowledgement. You want her to admit what she did, to recognize how it affected you, to say the words that make the disappointment feel less heavy. But the moment you wait for validation, you hand her emotional authority over you. You're asking her to decide whether your feelings are justified. You're giving her the power to determine the value of your experience. And that is the first step toward losing your self-respect. A woman who truly cares about you will not need to be chased into accountability. She will feel the shift in your energy, the disappointment behind your silence, the weight of what she caused, and she will address it on her own. She will talk, explain, apologize, and try to fix it because she values the connection and fears losing it. But a woman who minimizes your pain, avoids the conversation, or acts confused when you express yourself is showing you exactly what she thinks your feelings are worth. Indifference is an answer. Deflection is an answer. Delayed responses, short replies, sarcastic comments, these are all answers too. And the more you push for validation she has no intention of giving, the more you look like a man begging for emotional permission to feel what you already feel. The truth is painfully simple: your healing cannot depend on her acknowledgement. You don't argue your value. You don't negotiate your hurt. You don't explain yourself hoping she suddenly understands. Her reaction, or her lack of one, is your clarity. A man who respects himself takes that clarity and moves in a direction that protects his peace, not in circles trying to make her admit something she already knows. A woman's emotional patterns tell you everything you need to know long before her words ever do. Most men make the mistake of listening to what she says instead of observing what she consistently shows. When a woman hurts you and then behaves as if nothing happened, it's not because she forgot. It's because she's watching your response. She wants to see whether you'll challenge her, whether you'll let it slide, or whether you'll collapse into emotional confusion. Your reaction becomes data for her. It tells her how much she can get away with, how deeply you're attached, and how easily you can be pulled back into her emotional orbit. If she minimizes your feelings, twists the situation, or makes you feel guilty for even bringing it up, understand that this isn't just immaturity, it's a form of emotional deflection. Some women do this because they lack accountability, others do it because they want to maintain control without appearing wrong. And some do it because they've learned that apologizing gives away power, while shifting blame keeps them in the dominant emotional position. What you must pay attention to is the pattern. One moment of defensiveness can be human. A consistent lack of responsibility is a warning. A woman who values you will feel discomfort when she hurts you. She will correct herself without needing to be convinced. But a woman who uses guilt, silence, or confusion to avoid accountability is showing you that your emotional well-being is secondary to her comfort. When you respond to her patterns with calm observation instead of emotional reaction, you shift the entire dynamic. You step out of the role she expects you to play. And the moment she can no longer predict your responses, she can no longer control the emotional frame. This is how you regain power, not through force, but through awareness. Real power in a man does not come from raising his voice, threatening to leave, or trying to win an argument. Those are reactions rooted in fear, not strength. A woman can sense when you're fighting to regain control because you feel it slipping away. She can feel when your anger is really insecurity disguised as dominance. And the more emotionally reactive you become, the more she realizes that she has influence over you. That realization shifts the power entirely in her favor. The moment you step back and detach emotionally, everything changes. Your silence is not submission, it's clarity. Your calmness is not weakness, it's mastery. A woman expects you to argue, chase, or demand attention after she hurts you. She expects your emotions to spill out because that's what most men do. When you do the opposite, when you stay centered and deliberate, you disrupt the script she's used to running. Suddenly she is the one feeling uncertain, the one replaying the moment, the one analyzing what your silence means. Your emotional stillness forces her to confront the reality of her actions. She can dismiss your anger because it tells her you're still invested. She can dismiss your accusations because they make you look desperate for control. But silence unsettles her because she cannot measure it. She cannot manipulate calmness. She cannot argue with a man who refuses to engage in chaos. This shift in energy is what teaches her more than your words ever could. She begins to choose her tone more carefully, approach you with more respect, and think twice before crossing a boundary again. Not because she fears losing you, but because she finally feels the weight of your self-respect. And once a woman senses that she no longer controls your emotional state, the entire power dynamic realigns in your favor. A man who has been hurt by a woman often wants immediate validation, an apology, or at least some recognition of the pain she caused. This desire is natural, human even, but chasing it gives her power she does not deserve. Waiting for acknowledgement keeps you attached to the very person who wounded you, tethered to her emotional whims. Instead, the strongest response is to shift your focus inward. Your energy belongs to you, not to the person who has caused you pain. By redirecting your attention from seeking her validation to strengthening your own emotional, mental, and physical state, you reclaim the power she tried to hold over you. When a woman sees that her actions no longer evoke the reaction she expected, she begins to recalibrate. She watches your composure, your calm, and the way you no longer chase after explanations. She notices that you no longer allow her behavior to dictate your worth, your confidence, or your emotional stability. This observation, more than any argument or lecture, communicates your boundaries and your self-respect. She begins to understand, consciously or subconsciously, that the man she hurt cannot be manipulated, cannot be shaken, and cannot be drawn into chaos he does not wish to participate in. Furthermore, this internal shift does not just affect how she treats you, it transforms the way you carry yourself in every interaction. You become more intentional with your words, more measured in your responses, and more protective of your energy. The clarity and stability you exude create a magnetic presence, one that demands respect without demanding it verbally. Your silence, your composure, and your refusal to engage in emotional manipulation become the ultimate lessons in accountability, teaching her without confrontation, teaching her without words, and teaching her that a man who values himself cannot be hurt twice in the same way. Handling a woman who hurts you requires a deep understanding that her actions reveal more about her than about you. When a man internalizes the pain, reacts impulsively, or seeks immediate answers, he becomes trapped in a cycle that gives her control over his emotions. But once you step back and observe without reacting, you reclaim authority over your inner world. Emotional detachment does not mean indifference, it means recognizing the difference between responding from woundedness and responding from clarity. When you maintain composure, even in the face of hurt, you communicate strength in a way words cannot. She watches closely, often more than you realize, noticing whether you crumble or stand firm, whether you plead or protect your dignity. This observation alone begins to shift the dynamic between you. A man who handles hurt with discipline no longer validates the drama she creates. He doesn't argue to convince her of his worth, he simply embodies it. Silence becomes a tool of power because it removes her ability to manipulate your attention, which she once relied upon to measure her own control. Distance, when paired with composure, communicates a clear message: you will not tolerate repeated pain, and your emotional energy is not a resource to be exploited. This shift forces her to confront the consequences of her behavior, often prompting self-reflection she avoided when you were reactive. At the same time, this approach strengthens the man himself. By focusing on growth rather than resentment, he rebuilds his confidence, sharpens his judgment, and solidifies his boundaries. He becomes someone whose presence commands respect, whose absence communicates value, and whose energy cannot be destabilized by her volatility. Through calm strength and emotional sovereignty, the man transforms the relationship dynamic, teaching her accountability without confrontation, and demonstrating that true power lies in self-mastery rather than in controlling her. When a woman hurts you, one of the most crucial lessons is understanding that seeking her validation will never bring the peace you need. Most men instinctively look for explanations, apologies, or reassurance, hoping that hearing the right words will heal the wound. Yet relying on her to provide closure gives her power she doesn't deserve and often prolongs your suffering. True resolution comes not from her acknowledgement, but from your own clarity and emotional discipline. By stepping back, you create space to assess the situation objectively. You can see patterns in her behavior rather than getting lost in isolated moments, distinguishing between a one-time mistake and a recurring tendency to cause pain. This clarity allows you to protect your emotional boundaries without becoming cold or detached in an unhealthy way. When you stop chasing her approval, you stop feeding the very cycle that allowed her to manipulate your emotions. Silence, calm observation, and measured responses become tools of empowerment. She notices the change, whether she admits it or not, because her actions no longer elicit the predictable reactions she once relied upon. The absence of drama communicates your self-respect more effectively than arguments ever could. Handling hurt also means focusing on your growth rather than dwelling on resentment. The pain she caused becomes fuel for self-improvement, sharpening your mental strength, emotional resilience, and understanding of human behavior. As you rise above the chaos, you reclaim control of your energy, your attention, and your worth. In doing so, you transform the dynamic entirely. She begins to recognize, consciously or subconsciously, that the man she once affected no longer exists, and the man before her now commands respect, stability, and emotional sovereignty. This shift in presence is far more powerful than any confrontation, lecture, or plea for understanding. When a woman hurts you, the most profound shift comes when you realize that your response determines the entire dynamic of the relationship. Most men fall into the trap of reacting impulsively, trying to force clarity, seeking apologies, or pleading for explanations, but this only keeps them tied to the emotional chaos she creates. The real power lies in stepping back and observing without reacting, allowing yourself to process the situation fully before engaging. Emotional detachment doesn't mean shutting down or becoming numb, it means cultivating a space where your decisions come from clarity rather than pain. By refusing to engage in reactive behavior, you force her to confront her own actions and recognize that your emotional world cannot be manipulated. A woman who senses that you are no longer emotionally dependent on her begins to adjust her behavior, often without consciously realizing it. She becomes more cautious, more aware of her words and tone, and more respectful of the boundaries you have firmly established. Your calmness and composure become a mirror reflecting the difference between a man who is controlled by attachment and a man who has mastered his emotional sovereignty. This internal strength communicates far more than any argument, explanation, or demand ever could. At the same time, your focus must shift inward. The pain she caused should not become a prison but a catalyst for personal growth. Strengthen your mind, pursue your goals, invest in your self-worth, and prioritize your emotional peace. When she sees that her actions no longer destabilize you, she cannot help but feel the weight of her behavior. This subtle but powerful shift changes the dynamic permanently, not through confrontation or anger, but through the unwavering presence of a man who refuses to allow emotional chaos to dictate his life. By maintaining this stance, you reclaim your power and command respect that is both quiet and undeniable. Handling a woman who has hurt you reaches its pinnacle when you fully embrace the principle of self-respect and recognize that your emotional well-being is non-negotiable. At this stage, you understand that no explanation, apology, or attempt to manipulate your feelings can substitute for your own clarity and boundaries. You no longer wait for her to validate your pain, because you realize that seeking validation from someone who caused harm only gives them power they do not deserve. Instead, you focus entirely on yourself, on rebuilding, strengthening, and evolving in ways that make your peace and your growth the center of your life. This is not selfishness, it is wisdom. It is the understanding that a man who values his heart protects it first, and in doing so, becomes unassailable. When you consistently act from this place of calm strength, she begins to sense that the dynamic has shifted irrevocably. Her emotional influence diminishes because she can no longer predict your reactions or exploit your attachment. She becomes more measured in her words, more intentional in her actions, and more aware of the consequences of crossing boundaries. This does not happen because you impose it through force or anger, but because your presence communicates a new standard, one that demands respect through consistency, composure, and inner sovereignty. At the same time, your transformation becomes a mirror for her self-awareness. She may never say it aloud, but she recognizes that the man she once influenced emotionally is gone. In his place stands someone stronger, wiser, and unshakable. Your growth forces her to confront her own patterns, her own accountability, and the consequences of her past behavior. By stepping fully into this version of yourself, you not only protect your heart but also create a standard of interaction that cannot be ignored. The woman who hurt you now sees clearly, she no longer has the power to wound you, and that realization changes everything about how she approaches you, forever.